What happens when the forbidden signs are ignored and the shadows start to breathe? We're descending into 3 sealed cave systems where official protocol failed, and the horror that emerged still echoes in the minds of those who survived. In Snowdonia, Wales, Arthur's laser scan uncovers a mathematically perfect tunnel that predates all human history. His tablet renders a shifting geometry, sealing the path behind him, and monolithic stones begin grinding in the dark ahead. Beneath West Virginia, cave diver Elias surfaces inside a hidden air pocket. His light strikes calcified ribcages overhead, and the water suddenly plummets, drawn by a massive rhythmic inhale. On Australia's Nullarbor Plain, Chloe is lowered into an untouched sinkhole. She discovers fresh, massive tracks bursting from a shattered wall. Her radio shreds into violent static. The winch jams, and a wet, dragging sound closes in just beyond her headlamp. These are not myths. These are documented encounters that expose the true terror sleeping beneath our feet. Some depths were sealed for a reason. After tonight, you'll know why. Arthur had always found peace in the cold geometry of collapse risk assessments. Load-bearing vectors, fracture propagation, void migration. These were the silent languages of a dying mountain, and he spoke them fluently. The Leshwed deep levels had been officially condemned in 1974 after a series of disappearances that the council preferred to bury under paperwork rather than rubble. Arthur's brief from the Snowdonia National Park Authority was simple. Map the abandoned Victorian stopes with terrestrial LIDAR, identify any sinkhole propagation threatening the A470, and under no circumstances breach the sealed eastern galleries. The signs were explicit, corroded Welsh and English warnings bolted across a rusted iron gate deep in the main adit. Atmospheric contamination, unstable roof, proceed at risk of prosecution and death. Arthur set his tablet to real-time slam mode and ducked through a side collapse the gate had been designed to seal away. The air beyond the gate grew dense with the mineral taste of wet slate and something sharper zone, as if the rock itself had been electrically agitated. His headlamp carved a narrow cone of white through the suspended dust, revealing the familiar parallel walls of a 19th-century horse-level rail tracks warped into frozen serpents beneath his boots. For the first 300 meters, the scan data unspooled predictably across his tablet, a morose gray point cloud of fractured stopes and sagging roof beams held together by rust and geological spite. Then the tablet pinged, a subsurface void 22 meters ahead, geometry unrecognized, no mining signature, no natural karst pattern. The software defaulted to a single flagged word, anomalous. Arthur's curiosity overruled protocol before his conscious mind could object. He squeezed through a collapse of shattered shale, emerging on his belly into a space that should not have existed. The tunnel was perfectly circular, 2 meters in diameter, and its walls were utterly smooth, a seamless, obsidian-like polish that reflected his headlamp back at him in a distorted halo. There were no tool marks, no drill scarring, no pick grooves, no explosive scorching. The slate simply ended at the tunnel's threshold, as if the mountain had been surgically excised by something that predated the very concept of excavation. Arthur ran a gloved hand across the surface and felt a faint vibration, a subsonic hum that traveled through the bones of his wrist and settled into his molars like a tuning fork pressed against his skull. He lifted his tablet. The SLAM algorithm was struggling. The point cloud around the tunnel kept sliding, overlapping itself in fractal iterations that made the screen shudder. He took 3 steps deeper into the impossible cylinder, and the tablet's display stuttered into a full red-bordered alert mapping error. Relocalization failed. That was absurd. SL worked by tracking fixed reference points, walls, corners, ceiling features, but the tunnel offered none. It was mathematically perfect, a Euclidean abstraction that provided no texture for the software to grip. Arthur pivoted slowly, training his headlamp back toward the collapse he had crawled through, intending to capture a recognizable feature and force the system to re-anchor. What the light revealed froze the breath in his lungs. The collapse was gone, not obscured. not shadowed, are gone in its place. The seamless obsidian surface continued unbroken into the distance, curving away as if the tunnel had always been sealed at both ends. Arthur whispered a single exhalation of disbelief and watched it crystallize into a brief ghost that the darkness swallowed whole. He checked the tablet again, fingers trembling against the cold screen. The real-time 3D render of his trajectory. The dotted line recording his path from the entrance was rewriting itself in front of his eyes. The line no longer traveled straight, twisted, kinked, at impossible angles, folded back through coordinates that exceeded three-dimensional space. Behind his icon, the rendered tunnel was collapsing into a spiraling knot, the geometry shifting frame by frame, closing the way he had come, as if the passage were a throat, swallowing him one peristaltic contraction at a time. Arthur pressed his back against the smooth wall and felt the vibration grow stronger, a deep physical pressure that now registered not as a hum, but as a series of rhythmic pulses, slow, deliberate like breathing. The tablet's internal compass spun wildly, north dissolving into nonsense. He had no idea which direction led deeper and which led toward a past that was actively being erased. Somewhere ahead, beyond the limit of his headlamp's reach, a sound began. It started as a bass frequency so low that he felt it in his diaphragm before his ears could interpret it, a subterranean grinding that vibrated through the polished floor and rattled the fillings in his teeth. Arthur killed his lamp for a moment of pure sensory orientation, and in the absolute black, the grinding separated into distinct components, the slow, deliberate scrape of monolithic stones grinding against each other, rotating under pressures that only continental plates were supposed to generate. Each grinding revolution sent a puff of displaced air washing over his face, carrying a scent that was ancient and organic wet limestone, cold clay, and something else that his mind filed unwillingly under meat. He fumbled the lamp back on, and the beam caught the tunnel walls, 20 meters ahead, walls that were no longer static. The perfectly smooth surface was crawling with reflections, shifting facets of light that reordered themselves in patterns that hurt to follow, angles folding into angles, geometry that his brain rejected as physically impossible. The tunnel was reconfiguring itself, realigning toward him with the patience of something that had been waiting since before the Welsh mountains were young. Arthur turned and ran in the only direction available, away from the grinding, deeper into the cylinder that his tablet now rendered as an infinite recursive loop, an Ouroboros of non-Euclidean stone. His boots slipped on the frictionless floor, and every impact echoed in harmonic multiples, as if the tunnel were designed to amplify sound rather than dampen it. A concert hall built for something that listened rather than spoke. Behind him the grinding accelerated, the monolithic stones finding their rhythm, and Arthur understood with a clarity that emptied his mind of everything but raw animal terror. The tunnel was not a structure that had been built, it was a mechanism that had been sleeping, and it was waking up. The tablet's screen flickered, then stabilized on a single frame. A 3D reconstruction of the space directly ahead, rendered from the LIDAR pulses that were still firing automatically. The image showed a chamber opening 30 meters forward, a vaulted space with a floor that dropped away into a void so deep the LIDAR returned no bottom echo, and arranged around that chasm, standing in silent concentric rings, were shapes, upright, angular, symmetrical, not natural. Arthur's mind, trained in structural failure and the merciful logic of physics, offered him one final rational thought before the grinding drowned it out. Nothing in this mountain had ever been human, and the door behind him had not been built to keep people out. It had been built to keep something in. Ilias checked his rebreather for the fourth time, the ritualistic paranoia of a man who understood that one mistake in these depths meant becoming a permanent fixture of the flooded karst. The Devil's Throat system had swallowed 4 experienced divers since 1982, their bodies never recovered, their names etched on a plaque at the Monongahela National Forest Ranger Station that Elias walked past every morning. His mapping of the submerged conduits had identified an uncharted fissure at the 60-meter contour, a narrow vertical crack that pulsed colder water than the surrounding sump. Thermal anomaly, potential new chamber. He signaled his surface tender via the underwater comms line, confirmed the safety protocols, and slipped beneath the black mirror of the sump pool with the controlled grace of 2 decades of cave diving. The first 40 meters were familiar territory. Elias followed the gold line he had laid the previous summer, the thin nylon cord his only tether to a world with breathable atmosphere. His canister light cut the absolute darkness with a blade of white illuminating limestone walls that had been sculpted by acidic groundwater over millions of years. Flowstone draperies, dormant rimstone dams, the silent cathedral architecture of the deep karst. At the 60-meter mark, the fissure opened exactly where his sonar had predicted. A vertical gash in the wall no wider than his shoulders, exhaling water that was 4 degrees colder and carried a strange, faint taste even through his mouthpiece. Salinity impossible in a freshwater Appalachian aquifer. Elias paused, checked his gas mix, and made the decision that would haunt the remaining fragments of his sanity. He unclipped from the gold line and squeezed into the unknown. The fissure was a birth canal of stone that pressed against his back and chest simultaneously, the rebreather scraping with a sound that traveled through his bones. For 12 meters he inched through the constriction, exhaling fully to shrink his ribcage, feeling the rock grip him like a closing fist. Then the walls fell away and Elias was floating in total, silent black. No walls visible beyond his light. No floor, no ceiling. Neutral buoyancy in a void so vast his depth gauge gave conflicting readings. Confused by the sudden absence of reflective surfaces, he ascended slowly, following his bubbles, and after 3 minutes of controlled rise, his head breached a surface that should not have existed. An air pocket, oxygen-rich according to his handheld sensor, the atmosphere tasting of wet stone and something else, organic decay, ancient and faintly sweet, like a tomb unsealed after millennia. Elias pulled himself onto a sloping shelf of flowstone and knelt there, dripping, his breathing loud in the absolute stillness. He removed his full face mask and drew a lungful of the cavern air. It was cool, heavy, carrying an underground breeze that confirmed a connection to the surface somewhere far above. His light swept the ceiling first. The chamber was enormous, vaulted 30 meters overhead, and every surface was covered in stalactites of unusual thickness. Not the delicate soda straws of a typical cave. These formations were massive, each the girth of a human torso, their surfaces textured with a latticework of ridges that caught the light in a way that seemed almost organic. Elias walked deeper into the chamber, his neoprene boots squelching on the damp calcite floor, and the stalactites above began to resolve in the beam of his canister light. Not stalactites, ribcages, calcified, fossilized, but unmistakably the skeletal architecture of massive vertebrates hanging upside down from the ceiling, as if the creatures had been embedded in the limestone while the cave was still forming. The smallest ribcage was the size of a horse. The largest, spanning nearly 10 meters across, could have contained a small whale. Elias counted 17 sets before he stopped counting. They were arranged in a spiral pattern radiating outward from a central point deeper in the cavern, all oriented with their vertebrae fused into the ceiling, as if something had hung them there, or as if they had all been looking upward when the rock entombed them. He touched the nearest rib. The surface was cold, smooth, coated in a crystalline calcite glaze that fractured under his fingertips like sugar glass. Beneath it, the bone was not fossil gray, but a deep organic amber, as if the mineralization had preserved rather than replaced the original tissue. Elias whispered a single word into the dead air, "Impossible," and the cavern swallowed his voice without echo, the acoustics of the chamber tuned to absorb rather than reflect sound. It was then that he noticed the water. The pool he had emerged from was 15 meters behind him now, and its surface was retreating, not gradually visibly. The water level was dropping at a rate he could track with his eyes, the limestone walls of the sump slicking with moisture as the black surface sank centimeter by centimeter, revealing older waterlines etched into the stone like the rings of a drained bathtub. Ilias sprinted back to the edge, the instinct of a diver who knew that a lost sump meant a sealed tomb, but the retreat was too fast. By the time he reached the shelf, the pool had fallen 2 meters, then 3, exposing a steep-sided shaft that descended into darkness. His rebreather and mask were still at the waterline, sliding downward with the receding surface, and Elias threw himself flat on the wet calcite, reaching the water-dropped 5 meters in a single violent lurch. The sump was draining like a sinkhole unplugged, a roaring suction pulling the entire volume of the chamber downward, and Elias watched his life support equipment vanish into the throat of the earth with a sound like a giant swallowing. And then the sound continued after the water was gone, after the roar of drainage faded into the dripping silence of exposed limestone. Another sound emerged from the shaft. Deeper than the drainage, deeper than any sound Elias had ever heard outside of geological recordings of tectonic plates shifting, a rhythmic, sustained inhalation that vibrated through the stone beneath his chest. It lasted 11 seconds, long, slow, deliberate. The inhaling of something so vast that the entire cavern contracted around him, the rib cages overhead groaning as the pressure differential flexed the ancient bones. Then the pause, a held breath that stretched into 30 seconds of absolute silence, the kind of silence that precedes a scream. Ilias pressed his hands against his ears, but the sound was inside him now, traveling through the stone, through the soles of his boots, up his spine, into the amygdala-drenched architecture of his brain that still remembered predators from before humans were human. When the exhale came, it was worse. A deep, slow release of air that rushed up the shaft, stinking of methane and wet fur, and something profoundly biological, the breath of a metabolism that had been digesting for aeons. The air pressure in the chamber spiked, popping Elias's eardrums, and the rib cages overhead swayed in their limestone moorings as the exhalation gusted around him like the sigh of a god stirring in its sleep. Elias scrambled backward on his hands and knees, his mind reduced to a single imperative: move, climb, find the surface connection that the airflow proved existed. His light swept frantically across the chamber walls, searching for a passage, a ledge, anything that led upward, and the beam caught movement. The calcified ribcages were vibrating. Not from the wind. They were resonating at a frequency that matched the inhaling rhythm, as if the bones themselves were humming a subsonic note that Elias could feel in his teeth. The largest ribcage, the 10-meter giant at the center of the spiral, split along its vertebral seam with a crack like a gunshot. A fissure running the entire length of the fossilized spine, and from within that crack a pale, segmented appendage began to unfurl. Translucent, glistening with amniotic moisture, blind but questing, tasting the air of the chamber with a tip that divided into 3 fleshy lobes, each lined with cilia that pulsed in time with the breathing from the shaft below. Elias understood then that the rib cages were not fossils, they were wombs, and whatever had been calcified inside them for millennia was now waking. The breathing accelerated. The inhales shortening, quickening, the pause between them vanishing, until the sound was a continuous, cyclonic respiration that whipped the chamber air into a fetid gale. Water began to gush back up the shaft, not draining now but overflowing, the sump refilling with a liquid that was too warm, too thick, spilling across the flowstone shelf in waves that steamed against the colder cave atmosphere. Elias ran blind, directionless, into the darkness beyond the spiral of rib cages, his bare feet shredded on the sharp calcite, his lungs burning with the effort of sprinting through atmosphere that now tasted of copper and sulfur and the unmistakable protein stench of something newly born and ravenously hungry. Behind him, the first of the pale appendages tore free of its calcium shell with a wet, ripping sound, and the squirming mass hit the flooded floor with a splash that echoed like a slap, then another, the hatching chorus of 17 impossible things emerging into a world that had forgotten them. Elias found a vertical fissure, a chimney of fractured limestone that rose into darkness, and he wedged himself upward, climbing with torn fingernails and the desperate strength of prey below him. The breathing stopped, replaced by a silence that was far, far worse. Something was listening now, and in that silence, from the shaft where the water had drained and returned, a voice that was not a voice formed itself from the vibration of the stone. 3 syllables, guttural and wet, speaking in a frequency that Elias felt as a vibration in his sternum rather than heard as sound. The words were not words, they were his name, pronounced in the exhalation of something that had tasted his fear on the air and found it familiar. Chloe had spent 11 years extracting climate narratives from the silent archives of the Earth. Ice cores from Greenland, stalagmite records from Borneo, lake sediments from Patagonia. But the Nullarbor Plain offered something rarer, an unbroken paleoclimatic sequence stretching back 5 million years, locked inside a limestone sinkhole that satellite imagery had only discovered 12 months prior. The borehole samples from the rim had revealed pollen strata that predated the Pleistocene, and the science demanded a deeper core, a continuous extraction from the sinkhole floor itself, where the sediment had accumulated undisturbed since the Miocene. Chloe sat in the retrieval harness at the lip of the abyss, her headlamp cutting a vertical shaft of white into darkness, so complete it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The winch operator, a laconic local named Davo, checked the anchor bolts one final time and gave her a thumbs up that belied the concern tightening the corners of his sun-cracked mouth. She keyed her radio surface. "This is Chloe, comms check," over Davo's voice crackled back through the earpiece. "Reading you 5x5, dock, 300 meters of cable. You see anything weird, you call it?" Over Chloe smiled at the irony of weird in a hole no human had ever entered and signaled for descent. The walls of the sinkhole slid past in the peripheral wash of her headlamp. Smooth limestone at first, weathered by millennia of rainwater, then transitioning into a darker, denser formation. The ancient marine limestone of the Nullarbor, compressed from the skeletons of billions of prehistoric organisms. The temperature dropped with each meter, the dry desert heat of the surface giving way to a cool, damp stillness that smelled of wet calcium and time. At 200 meters, her depth gauge registered a slight widening of the shaft, and her lamp caught the first glimpse of the floor, a pale, undulating surface of sediment and fallen scree, untouched by wind or water since the roof had collapsed during some forgotten Pleistocene storm. Her boots touched down with a soft crunch, and Chloe unclipped from the harness, the cable tension releasing above her with a faint musical twang that echoed up the shaft like a plucked guitar string left to fade into silence. The sinkhole floor was larger than the borehole data had suggested, an oval chamber roughly 30 meters across, the walls scalloped into alcoves and recesses that played tricks with her lamp's throw, creating pockets of absolute shadow that seemed to shift when she turned her head. Chloe oriented herself to the south wall, where the sediment profile was thickest, and began unpacking the coring equipment. The hollow steel auger, the extension rods, the sterilized collection tubes that would hold 5 million years of unbroken climate history. She worked methodically, the rhythm of assembly calming the instinctive unease that every human feels when standing at the bottom of a dark hole. The sediment beneath her boots was soft, almost powdery, a pale gray marl that puffed into small clouds with each footstep and hung suspended in the still air. She positioned the auger, applied downward pressure, and began the first extraction. The steel bit rotated smoothly through the surface strata, cutting a neat cylinder, and Chloe felt the familiar satisfaction of a good core sample until the auger struck something that was not limestone. It was a sharp, brittle resistance that transmitted up through the tool with a sound like breaking crockery, not rock bone. Chloe withdrew the auger and carefully excavated the point of impact with a hand trowel, brushing aside the gray sediment to reveal a surface that gleamed pale yellow in her lamp. A scapula, massive, at least 4 times the size of any extant Australian megafauna, its edges sharp and fresh as if the animal had died weeks rather than millennia ago. She sat back on her heels, her scientific mind racing through the possibilities. Diprotodon, the giant wombat, had been extinct for 40,000 years, but the Nullarbor's stable temperatures and dry atmosphere could theoretically preserve organic material far longer, except this bone was not fossilized, it was clean. The marrow cavity still held traces of a dark, organic residue that glistened wetly when she tilted the bone toward her light. Chloe's breath quickened, and she reached for her radio. "Surface, I have a significant find down here. Large vertebrate remains, preservation state, anomalous, requesting permission to document before continuing core extraction." Over. Davos' response was fractured, the transmission breaking into syllables that did not quite align. Copy low break. Upsay gain. Chloe adjusted the frequency, frowning. Surface, repeat transmission. Your signal is degraded. Over. The radio erupted in violent static, a shrieking white noise that clawed through her earpiece and forced her to rip it away from her ear. In the sudden silence that followed, another sound filled the sinkhole, a scraping. Low grinding, the sound of stone moving against stone under immense pressure, coming from somewhere deeper in the chamber, beyond the reach of her lamp. Chloe rose slowly, the bone still clutched in her gloved hand, and turned toward the source of the noise. Her headlamp swept across the southern alcove, the deepest recess of the chamber, and froze on a sight that her brain took 3 full seconds to interpret. The cavern wall had been breached, not collapsed. Shattered, a jagged opening, 3 meters high and twice as wide, punched outward from the limestone as if something had exploded from within the solid rock. The fragments of the wall lay scattered across the sediment floor in a fan pattern, their broken edges clean, unweathered, dust still suspended around them in a fine haze that had not yet settled. Recent, impossibly recent, and leading out from that shattered moor, pressed deep into the soft gray marl, was a trail of tracks. They were bipedal impressions, each print longer than Chloe's entire arm, the shape roughly plantigrade with 3 forward-facing digits that terminated in deep, clawed punctures. The spacing between each track was 2 meters. Sometimes 3, indicating a stride that no terrestrial animal of the Nullarbor could achieve. Chloe counted 14 prints before the line curved behind a fallen pillar of flowstone and vanished into the darkness of the chamber's far side, heading not toward the shattered wall, but away from it, out of the breach, across the sinkhole floor, and into the shadows behind her. The radio crackled back to life in her trembling hand. Davos' voice suddenly crystal clear. "Doc? Doc, what's going on down there? Your vitals just spike it. You're reading 130 BPM. Chloe, talk to me. Over?" She keyed the transmit button, her voice emerging as a whisper she barely recognized. "Davo, pull me up. Abort the extraction. There's something down here, something that broke out of the wall. I need immediate retrieval. Do you copy?" "Over," the static returned, but this time it was layered. Beneath the electronic shrieking, she could hear Davos' voice distorted as if shouting through water. "Winch jammed, trying reset. Hold position." The cable above her head twanged, the harness jerking upward 1/2 meter before stopping with a violent grinding snap that echoed through the shaft like a gunshot. Chloe looked up, her lamp illuminating the steel cable whipping in lazy, uncontrolled spirals as the winch mechanism 300 meters above fought against a lock that should never have engaged. Then the second sound reached her, not from above, from behind the fallen flowstone pillar, 10 meters to her left, somewhere in the darkness where the tracks had led. A wet, heavy dragging, the slick friction of a large mass being pulled across loose rocks, accompanied by a rhythmic, labored exhalation that was not quite breathing. It was panting, the sound of something that had exerted itself tremendously and was now recovering, resting, waiting. Chloe killed her headlamp, plunging herself into the absolute black of the sinkhole floor, and pressed her back against the cold limestone wall. The dragging stopped. In the perfect silence that followed, she heard a new sound, a soft, inquisitive sniffing, the nasal intake of something scenting the air with olfactory organs far more sensitive than any human's. It was tracking her. The carbon dioxide of her exhalations, the adrenaline-laced sweat beading on her skin, the protein signature of the ancient bone still clutched in her hand. The sniffing grew louder, closer, the pauses between inhalations shortening as the creature caught a definitive trace and oriented itself. Chloe's thumb found the transmit button of the radio, and she whispered into the microphone with a calm that she did not feel, "Davo, the winch. Anything, please." The radio screamed static back at her, but beneath the noise, impossibly, she heard Davo's voice, hearing something on the cable pulling from below. The cable above her jerked again, this time downward, yanking the harness drum against the limestone roof with a screech of metal. And from the darkness where the tracks disappeared, the dragging resumed, faster now, no longer tired, curious and hungry, and closing the distance with a wet, scraping urgency that told Chloe the creature had been alone in its stone prison for longer than the human species had existed, and she was the first living thing it had smelled in 5 million years. Arthur's mapping tablet still renders impossible geometries beneath Snowdonia. Elias's rebreather lies in a breathing Appalachian abyss. Chloe's radio transmits static from a Nullarbor sinkhole where something woke up. 3 ranges, 3 forbidden depths, no official answers. Now, in the heavy silence of this room, slow your breathing and imagine the absolute blackness beneath your own feet. If you were suspended over a darkness that breathed, would you open your eyes? Would you listen? Or pray the winch didn't jam? If these encounters crawled under your skin, you know the ritual. Subscribe to Mr. Whisper's official Ring the Bell for the next descent. Comment story that burrowed deepest and share this video before the void swallows it whole. Take one final deep breath. Hold it. Remember, the deepest caves don't echo human screams, they consume them. Sleep with lights on.